Her, I choose her. The two words dropped into the sun-baked silence of the barren town square, like stones into a dried well. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical cessation of breath, a collective intake of air so sharp it could have torn the dusty atmosphere. Every eye in the square, from the sneering local drunk to the most primly dressed matron, was locked in disbelief. The source of the pronouncement was Kellen, the colossal figure of the cowboy who stood motionless on the raised platform. He was an enigma in the town, a man defined by his uncompromising size and his severe isolation, and now he had made a choice that defied all logic, all expectation, and all social cruelty. His choice, the object of this seismic disruption, was Maeve. She stood shivering at the end of the line of marriageable women, clad in a ridiculous, too-tight red dress that felt like a public accusation. Maeve had been bracing for a public rejection, the inevitable second blow of humiliation after the day's earlier ordeal. Yet the sound of her name, or rather the pronoun referring to her, being chosen by him, was a greater shock than any scorn. She was paralyzed, her focus fixed on the shadow of Kellen's boot on the dusty platform, unable to process the sound, the silence, or the collective gaze of the town now piercing her back. Around her, the scene unfolded in slow motion. Quartus Holt, the county leader, who had orchestrated this confrontation, stood frozen. His face, usually a florid portrait of rage and authority, was suddenly slack with a mixture of confusion and triumphant malice. He had succeeded in forcing the cowboy's hand, but Kellen had chosen the most ruinous, the most challenging path. Holt's intention had been to humiliate Kellen. Kellen had simply turned the humiliation into a public act of utter, incomprehensible defiance. The square itself, typically a chaotic hub of commerce, was utterly still. The late afternoon sun beat down, cooking the red dust. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the sweat of nervous anticipation. For hours the tension had been building, fueled by the spectacle of the choosing, a mandatory ceremony designed to maintain the town's harsh social order by pairing off the undesirable women and forcing compliance from the recalcitrant men. Kellen, by his very nature, represented the ultimate non-compliance. The line of women dissolved into panicked whispers. Their bright dresses, silks, satins, and lace suddenly seemed trivial compared to the raw, exposed fate Maeve now faced. The beautiful, high-status Rowan, who had stood closest to Kellen and whose beauty was supposed to guarantee her safety, stood rigid. Maeve had seen Rowan's expression right before the choice was made, a fleeting, intense terror of being ignored, followed by absolute disbelief that Kellen had preferred the town's punchline over her perfection. Maeve's mother, Mistress Thresher, a woman defined by her own social failure, could only manage a choked, wounded gasp before quickly covering her face. For Mistress Thresher, this was not salvation. It was a deeper, more profound form of public exposure, a bizarre, unsuitable marriage that promised continued hardship and ridicule. The whispers began to rise, sharp and cruel. He's mad. He's thrown his life away. He chose the burden. Kellen, finally moving, stepped down from the platform. His motion was slow, deliberate, and final. He reached Maeve, his hand vast and rough, settling on her trembling arm. He did not look at her, nor did he look at the crowd. He looked only toward the direction of the open road, signaling the absolute end of the confrontation. Maeve, still trapped in a sensory overload, allowed herself to be pulled forward. She felt the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes dissecting her form, her dress, and her desperate lack of grace. As they moved away, Kellen's choice was not perceived as an act of mercy, but as a deliberate commitment to ruin. Maeve was not saved. She was simply traded for a different, shared form of public condemnation. She was the town's biggest joke, walking away with the town's biggest enigma. This was the conclusion of her public humiliation and the terrifying, uncertain start of everything else. Thank you for the precise word count and the insightful analysis. I acknowledge the shortfall of 515 words in Act 1 and recognize that the emotional depth can still be maximized. I will integrate your suggestions, specifically focusing on the contrast between Kellen and Maeve, a childhood flashback to root Maeve's trauma, and enhanced sensory detail during the humiliation scene to ensure the act reaches the 2,000-word target while maintaining the psychological and literary tone. The sudden, shocking reality of Kellen's choice, the abrupt, violent conclusion to her life in Barron, had barely registered before Maeve's mind retreated. Riding away on the wagon, her gaze was fixed on the churning dust behind them, her consciousness spiraling back into the suffocating reality she was leaving. The center of that reality was the cold, relentless tyranny of her mother, Mistress Thresher. Every morning began not with light, but with the cold, sharp presence of her mother's voice. "Up! You'll stand there today, Maeve, and you will not disgrace me further." Mistress Thresher's face, etched by internal bitterness rather than sun or time, was a permanent portrait of disappointment. This disappointment was more than emotional. It was a calculated act of control. For 18 years, Mistress Thresher had systematically worked to dismantle any flicker of self-worth. If Maeve found a brief moment of pleasure, a particular ribbon, a stray cat, a simple tune hummed to herself, Mistress Thresher would quickly eliminate it. The brutal lesson was constantly reinforced. Maeve's desires were offensive, and any act of self-expression was an invitation to punishment. Maeve lived in a state of permanent apology, her posture hunched, her movements hesitant, convinced that her very being was an imposition. "I am cumbersome. I am unwanted. I must minimize myself." Maeve's memory flashed to a harsh winter afternoon when she was perhaps 8 years old. She had found a worn wooden bird carved by her absent father and had spent hours painting it bright blue with stolen kitchen dyes. When she proudly presented it, Mistress Thresher did not strike her. Instead, she took the bird and held it over the fire. "That," her mother had said, watching the paint bubble and blacken, "is a foolish, childish waste. You are not delicate, Maeve. You are clumsy and large. Learn to stop wishing for things you can never be." That night, Maeve was sent to bed without supper, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach becoming indistinguishable from the gnawing emptiness in her spirit. She learned that hunger was tied to her lack of delicacy, and that shame was the only thing she truly earned. The oppressive atmosphere of the town intensified this domestic misery. Maeve's errands were never simple tasks. They were gauntlets of public scrutiny. The wind, a constant presence in Barron, seemed to carry the judgment of the town itself, whipping the loose dust against Maeve's face, an abrasive reminder of the town's indifference. Before the choosing, Maeve's final errands were the hardest. She passed the group of town elders who watched her with cold, measuring eyes, confirming their collective judgment: worthless. It was in this atmosphere of endemic scorn that Kellen first appeared in Maeve's vision, a shadow of monumental stature against the town's flat landscape. He rode in silently, a man of such immense, contained power that the townsfolk, who usually preyed on weakness, treated him with a grudging, fearful respect. While the women eyed him with desperate hope and the men with suspicion, Maeve only felt the contrast. He is honored and solitary. I am mocked and exposed. She noticed the way the dust settled instantly behind his powerful horse, while her own path seemed eternally kicked up by the scornful glances she received. Maeve had developed a coping mechanism that was, in itself, a form of self-abuse, self-betrayal. She preemptively agreed with their verdict. They are right. I am too slow. I eat too much. I am clumsy. By embracing this painful narrative, she hoped to preempt the external blow, finding a grim, perverse comfort in internalizing the cruelty. The inevitability of the spectacle reached its peak at the market square. 3 local troublemakers surrounded her, turning her into an unwilling, clumsy performer. "Here's the blushing bride. Show us a dance, Maeve." The air was tight with anticipated laughter. Maeve tried to evade them, her body seizing up in the familiar rigidity of terror. Her foot caught the edge of a loose plank. She stumbled violently, the heavy bucket of water she carried flying and soaking a woman whose skirt she had desperately tried to avoid. The woman shrieked, and the crowd erupted in a brutal, deafening roar of laughter. Maeve lay on the ground, the raw dust chafing her palms. The sound was immense, but she also noticed a small, freckled boy, no older than 10, trying to hide his face behind his mother's skirt, while his own mouth was twisted in an effort to join the laughter. His genuine pity, quickly masked by social compliance, was a microcosm of the town's toxic mechanism. The sheer physical sensation was overwhelming, the smell of the overturned water mixing with the horse manure and sun-baked dust, the harsh grating of the earth against her palms. The sound of the laughter was a tangible, suffocating weight pressing her into the dirt. I deserve this, she thought, utterly defeated. Fleeing the immediate spectacle, Maeve hid in the dark, dusty alleyway of a stable. From there, she observed Rowan, the town's golden girl. Rowan was radiant, poised, the embodiment of Baron's social success. Yet Maeve noticed a chilling exchange. An older, matriarchal figure approached Rowan, praising her beauty, but then delivered a dark caution. You must secure a good husband quickly, dear. Beauty fades, and then... The woman's gaze drifted pointedly toward the alley where Maeve was hiding. Rowan's perfect smile instantly wavered, revealing a glimpse of intense, cold panic. When Rowan's gaze flicked toward Maeve, the expression was clear, pure, terrified aversion. Rowan feared Maeve not out of contempt, but because Maeve was the living proof of the consequences of failure, the fate awaiting those who could not maintain perfection. Maeve realized the town system poisoned everyone. The final bell clanged, calling the women to the square. Mistress Thresher, whose panic was rooted in the loss of her own precarious social standing, brutally forced Maeve into the tight red dress. You will wear this. Do not embarrass me. You will ruin me. The hooks scraped closed, painfully tight. The dress felt like a uniform of public execution. As Maeve walked to the square, she encountered Holt directly. He stopped her, his gaze sweeping her form with unconcealed disgust. He had not yet selected her as Kellen's burden, but he savored the moment. You are here, Maeve, Holt stated, his voice condescendingly loud. A testament to hope, or perhaps desperation. Your mother's final attempt. I'll give the cowboy a choice. The gold of Rowan or the dust of you. Pray that he is truly desperate, girl. For if you return unwed, this town will forget you ever existed. Maeve met his gaze briefly, not with defiance but with sheer, exhausted endurance. She walked to the line, repeating her only remaining self-affirmation. I am here. I endure. She took her place at the end of the line, waiting for the expected final rejection that became the most shocking choice of her life. The journey to Kellen's ranch was conducted in a profound, unsettling silence that stretched the vast, empty prairie. Maeve sat next to the supplies, physically exhausted but mentally alert, watching Kellen's large silhouette, which was dominant yet still against the backdrop of rust-colored, silent hills. When they finally arrived, the isolation was absolute. The cabin, sturdy but Spartan, stood as an unyielding structure against the wilderness. Inside, the silence deepened, becoming a powerful vacuum that slowly began to suck out the toxic, auditory clutter of Baron. Maeve waited, every muscle coiled, for the inevitable accusation, the raised voice, or the look of regret over his rash choice. But Kellen simply attended to his chores, mending a bridle by the dim lamplight, banking the fire, without fanfare or comment. He spoke only to direct her to a cot and offer her water. His silence was not the cold silence of disapproval. It was a profound, neutral space. He was not waiting for her to fail. He was simply existing. This neutrality was a powerful psychological balm. For the first time, Maeve realized she didn't have to fill the space with nervous apologies or chatter. She could hear her own thoughts, separate from the echoing condemnations of Mistress Thresher, and the constant, internalized tension in her muscles began, marginally, to ease. Maeve understood that Kellen treated her not as a burden, but as a simple fact of life to be accommodated without comment. And in that silent sanctuary, the seed of self-respect was quietly planted. The next morning, Kellen assigned her tasks, managing the kitchen, the chicken coop, and general upkeep. Expecting to be useless, Maeve proceeded to fail spectacularly and often. She scorched the gruel, almost set the stovepipe alight with a panicked rush of wood, and turned the first batch of lye soap into a useless, caustic slurry. She would freeze with each error, shrinking, bracing for the fury. Yet Kellen's teaching was precise and dispassionate. He treated her failures as data points, never judgments. When she struggled with the volatile wood stove, he didn't shout. He simply placed her hands near the searing cast iron. The fire is greedy, Maeve. It reflects your own anxiety. You must feed it slowly, steadily. Learn to respect the heat. Don't surrender to its hunger. He taught her the anatomy of skill, how to hold the hammer so the blow came from controlled wrist motion, not brute arm strength, how to patch fabric with tiny, consistent stitches that drew the material together instead of tearing it further apart. But the greatest challenge was the sourdough starter. Maeve struggled with it for a full week, wasting flour and producing rock-hard lumps. She discovered that making bread was an exercise in patience and trust, requiring consistent, gentle pressure. She realized her fear and haste, products of her life in Barren, were her greatest obstacles. She had always rushed her work to minimize the time for ridicule. Now she was forced to work slowly, deliberately. When she finally produced a loaf that was light and evenly browned, Kellen took a slice, chewed slowly, and gave a single, solid nod. "Good work. Keep the starter warm." That single earned phrase, devoid of false flattery, was more valuable than all the empty compliments of her life. Her self-worth began to solidify, built on the solid reality of her own competence. The silent contract between them deepened when Maeve, tidying a dusty drawer, found the glass vial filled with dead seeds and a faded sketch of a smiling woman. Kellen found her staring at the relic and, for the first time, his granite reserve cracked. He spoke of Lillian, detailing not just her kindness, but her intense, fatalistic struggle against the land. Lillian believed in beauty. She planted these seeds every spring, and every summer the earth killed them. Then the fever took her. Kellen confessed the root of his profound fatalism. "I was convinced that anything I loved, anything I touched, would wither here. I built these walls not to keep people out, but to keep the pain in. I accepted the land's verdict of barrenness." He admitted that he chose Maeve not for strength, but because he believed he deserved a burden, a difficult reflection of his own inner brokenness. Maeve realized their marriage was not a transaction of duty, but a shared battle against a spiritual curse. Maeve took the vial of seeds. Her resolve solidified into a burning purpose. She had to prove to Kellen that his judgment of himself was wrong. She had to defeat the inner Baron that governed his life. Days passed in a blur of aching muscles and raw determination. Maeve began her relentless, consuming work on the small patch of soil behind the cabin, turning it into an epic physical struggle, a direct war against the unforgiving landscape. She spent hours hauling rocks and striking the clay, the weight of the pickaxe forcing her to learn endurance instead of brute strength. Each evening, when her back throbbed and her palms bled, she found a strange, profound comfort in this honest pain, realizing it was cleaner and simpler than the years of emotional shame inflicted by her mother. "This pain is real," she told herself. The shame was a lie. She studied Kellen's old almanacs, mixing manure, wood ash, and sand into the stubborn soil, learning to coax life where the earth refused to yield. She constructed small stone walls to retain water, learning to micromanage the environment, using her mind, a tool Mistress Thresher had always dismissed, to solve a physical problem. Water was a precious currency, and she carried it from a distant creek, rationing every drop. She tore strips from her old voluminous shawl, the last vestige of her barren life, to create a makeshift canopy, shielding the soil from the sun. The shawl, once a symbol of shame, became a canopy of hope. Kellen observed her constantly, often pausing his work on the ridge. He never intervened. His silence was now one of respect and profound trust, a gift of self-reliance. He granted her the dignity of the struggle. Maeve, sensing his eyes, pushed harder, knowing she was fighting not just for the flowers, but for his belief in life itself. The writing lessons continued, evolving into an essential metaphor for their deepening relationship. Maeve was still hesitant, expecting to fail, to be awkward. Kellen focused on teaching her subtlety over force. "The horse will fight force," he instructed. "It will respond to trust. You must ask for its movement, and when it gives, you must release the pressure. This was the core lesson for their marriage: communication through guidance and timely release. Maeve learned that her own body was not a burden, but a tool. She stopped thinking about the judgment of the town and focused solely on the horse and Kellen's quiet instruction. When she finally learned to manage the bridle with light pressure, the mare responded instantly, moving with effortless grace. Maeve broke into a full gallop, and the wind tore through her hair. She felt the thrill of unfettered power. She threw her head back, and a large, full-throated laugh, a primal sound of pure, unadulterated joy, tore from her throat, echoing across the hills. It was the sound of her self-acceptance. Kellen stopped his horse, his eyes filled with profound emotion. He didn't compliment her riding. "That sound," he said, his voice thick. "That is the sound of life, Maeve. That is the strongest spirit I have ever known. Don't ever let them tell you what you are again." He had heard her soul, unbound by the barren curse. The culmination of Maeve's secret, painful labor arrived on a cool, clear morning. Kellen was mending a fence when he froze, his eyes fixed on the small patch of earth. A cluster of tiny, defiant blue, yellow, and violet flowers had burst forth from the cracked soil. They were small, but they were vibrantly, undeniably alive. He walked slowly to the patch, his massive frame trembling slightly. He knelt, not looking at the blooms, but running his fingers over the newly fertile, dark soil. The barrenness was gone. The curse was broken. He walked directly to Maeve, bypassing the flowers. He took her face in his hands, his eyes wet with a relief that was years in coming. "That patch of earth," he whispered, his voice catching, "had everything it needed, Maeve. It just needed someone who would not stop believing." "You are the belief." He pulled her close. This was the moment of absolute truth, a vow that superseded all law. "I chose you by force, but I keep you by choice," he declared, his eyes holding hers in a fierce, tender lock. "I choose the life you bring. I choose the certainty that you will always prove the curse wrong." Their kiss was a quiet, deep sealing of their contract, a partnership built on hard work, shared sorrow, and unconditional respect. Maeve knew she had found a sanctuary where her worth was defined by her soul, not her size. That is an excellent request. Removing the structural headers will allow the emotional and narrative flow of the climax to build naturally, making the reading experience feel truly immersive, like listening to the final chapters of a novel. The ride back into Barren 2 months later was a gauntlet of the unspoken. The late autumn air, thin and cool, offered no comfort, carrying only the ubiquitous scent of dry earth and the heavy weight of social expectation. Maeve sat tall in the wagon, her spine straight, a posture that felt both alien and profoundly earned. Her new dress, simple green canvas woven by her own hands, allowed her body to move naturally, unconstrained by the painful bindings Mistress Thresher had once inflicted. She was physically stronger, her arms firm from labor, her gaze steady, receiving the stares of the first farmers they passed not with dread, but with quiet, absolute dignity. She was no longer avoiding eyes. She was meeting them. The town square was exactly as she remembered it, the dust red and unforgiving, the buildings leaning with age and judgment. Maeve felt a ghostly echo of her former self, the one who had stumbled, drenched and humiliated in this very space. She saw the familiar faces, the elders, the gossips, the troublemakers, all drawn to the spectacle of Kellen's return with his burden. In the center, she spotted Rowan beside her husband, Sterling. Rowan was perfection in expensive velvet, her hair precisely coiled. But Maeve, with her newfound sight, saw the tension around Rowan's eyes, the tight, brittle quality of a smile that masked a profound cage. Rowan saw them approach, and her reaction was instantaneous. A defensive hardening of the face, followed by a fleeting, intense look of complex, envious loss. Rowan had secured the prize the town valued. Maeve had secured true freedom, and Rowan knew the difference. Their fragile peace was instantly challenged by the appearance of Cordus Holt. He emerged from the magistrate's office, his deputies trailing him, his face a mottled canvas of furious determination. Maeve sensed the deep personal offense Kellen's happiness represented to Holt's belief system. Kellen! Holt's voice boomed, sharp and demanding, attempting to regain the command he felt slipping away. Your property is registered as barren land. This affects your standing and the legality of this arrangement. It proves this woman is a disastrous choice, legally and financially. He spoke of the land's worthlessness as if it were a direct measurement of Maeve's soul. Holt's intention was to bait Kellen, forcing the giant to lash out, to prove his rash decision was the ruin Holt predicted. Kellen remained calm, his stillness more unnerving than any rage. Is the property in debt, Holt? He asked, his voice low. It is worse than debt. It is worthless. It is sinking into the earth, just like your judgment in choosing this lump of useless flesh. Holt shrieked, pointing cruelly at Maeve. His voice cracked with the uncontrolled venom of his hatred, the final epithet a desperate, vile attempt to wound. At that epithet, Maeve felt the old, cold paralysis, a searing echo of the shame she had carried for years. Her breath hitched, but the paralysis lasted only a fraction of a second. The image of the bright, defiant flowers Kellen had touched, the blue and violet blooms that defied the curse, flashed behind her eyes. The physical memory of the pickaxe, the honest pain of turning the soil, filled her chest. The land is no longer barren, and neither am I. Kellen's eyes narrowed. In that brief moment, his massive shoulders seemed to tense, a micro moment of vulnerability that only Maeve recognized. Holt's words had cut too close to Kellen's old wound, the failure to save Lillian. He needed Maeve to stand, not just for herself, but to heal his ancient guilt. He controlled the reaction instantly, regaining his unyielding composure. Kellen stepped forward, his shadow engulfing Holt, making the magistrate appear brittle and small. He spoke not of law, but of spiritual truth. You speak of worth and burden, Kellen declared, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. But you understand nothing of value. He placed his large grounding hand on Maeve's shoulder. The touch was a silent vow. This woman, Kellen declared, addressing the silent, watching crowd, is the only life that has bloomed in this entire town. She took my land, which I had abandoned to despair, and brought life back to it. She brought peace back to my soul. I keep her because she is my salvation, my choice, and my equal. The square fell into a shocked, stunned silence. Maeve inhaled the red dust and the clean scent of the wind that whipped around her skirts. She stepped forward, her body upright, meeting the collective gaze of the town without flinching. Her heart pounded a fierce rhythm against her ribs, but her voice was clear and steady, ringing with the authority of absolute conviction. You called me a joke, Maeve stated, looking directly at the crowd, her voice carrying the memory of every whisper, every insult. You judged me by my mother's failures. You defined me by my clumsiness and my size. I came here today to tell you, I am free of your eyes. I am free of your judgment. Her words were a definitive, non-negotiable end to her old life. A sudden, fast, joyous burst of fiddle music erupted from the saloon, piercing the silence, a tune full of life and defiance. Maeve's eyes met Kellen's, fierce and radiant. Dance with me, Kellen, she whispered, her eyes shining with absolute courage. Right here, in their dust. Kellen's eyes filled with a pride so profound it was almost palpable. He took her into his arms. The dance of freedom began. The town square became a silent, watchful ring, the tension shifting from accusation to a complex, fascinated awe. Kellen led the dance with a measured, powerful grace, spinning Maeve in wide, fluid circles. She moved with an effortless fluidity that defied her size and history. The green fabric of her dress flared, an explosion of color against the red dust. For Maeve, the world dissolved into motion and sound. She was no longer Maeve, the burden, but Maeve, the unburdened, powerful in her own gravity. She threw her head back, and her laugh, the full-throated, magnificent laugh Kellen had first heard on the prairie, rang out, a physical declaration of self-acceptance. In that moment, she remembered the visceral shame of her fall in the dust, the red dress burning her skin, the crushing weight of public scorn. She juxtaposed that painful ghost with the present reality, standing tall, held by respect, moving with absolute joy. The victory was immense, palpable, and entirely internal. She was dancing not for them, but for the girl who had been starved and shamed, showing her that life was possible. Quartus Holt watched his power crumble before this display of genuine, vibrant happiness. He slammed his fist onto a hitching post, his composure utterly shattered. "Stop that disgraceful exhibition!" he shrieked, his voice cracking and thin. The pathetic sound of a bully whose weapon, shame, had just failed. His defeat was total, not in law but in spirit. He was reduced to a screaming, impotent figure as the music swelled around him. As the music faded, Kellen dipped Maeve low, holding her gaze with fierce tenderness. The crowd remained silent, stunned into introspection. Then came the sound. Clap, clap, clap. It was Rowan. Her husband Sterling tried to pull her away, his face etched with embarrassment. Rowan stood alone, her composure finally shattered by the honesty of Maeve's joy. She clapped slowly, her eyes locked on Maeve. In her gaze there was searing envy for the freedom she herself lacked, but beneath it, a sudden, sharp, and undeniable respect. It was a single fragile moment of grace, acknowledging the true prize Maeve had won. "They called you a burden," Kellen murmured, pulling her close, resting his forehead against hers. "You are everything." Maeve smiled, a peaceful, complete smile. Hand in hand, they walked away from the silent, judging town and the angry, settled dust of Barron, leaving the shame and the defeated magistrate to crumble behind them forever. 2 years passed, and the barren ranch, once a symbol of defeat and sorrow, was transformed into a vibrant haven. The small patch of wildflowers had expanded into a glorious, sprawling garden that painted the rusty hillsides with improbable color. Maeve stood by the cabin window, her figure strong and serene, holding her infant daughter Lillian, named for the renewal of hope, a name now cleansed of tragedy. Kellen entered, his massive frame radiating a profound, settled peace. He took Lillian into his large, gentle arms, his eyes full of warmth as he watched the child's tiny fingers grasp his own. He and Maeve walked out to the garden, Maeve gathering fresh, ripe seeds from the newest blooms. Together, their movements perfectly synchronized, they scattered the new seeds into the rich, dark soil, a shared sacred act, the physical manifestation of their ongoing commitment to life. Their moment was briefly interrupted by the rumble of a carriage. Mistress Thresher stood stiffly on the edge of the garden, driven by some lingering sense of duty or perhaps curiosity. Her eyes swept over the thriving life, the healthy child, and the peaceful strength of her daughter. "She's a healthy child, I suppose," she conceded grudgingly, her voice thin and dry. "You finally managed to do something useful, Maeve?" Maeve looked at her mother. The words, once devastating, held no power. She saw her mother not as a tyrant, but as a lost woman still trapped by Barron's cold judgment. Maeve simply smiled gently, a silent acknowledgement that the cycle of shame was irrevocably broken. She rejoined Kellen and Lillian. The barren land, once the symbol of their deepest sorrow, was now the fertile ground of their everlasting life. The seeds of hope had bloomed, and true life had triumphed over the deepest barrenness of the human spirit.